Hi everyone. The only thing more embarrassing than me having to make these videos is the thought that you are going to have to watch them. Oh gosh, I hope these aren't terrible. Anyway, this is our attempt to continue our instruction about fallacies during the time away with the school closure. And I'm hoping and I believe that this is the best content of the class for teaching remotely in this way. Please make sure as soon as you're done watching this video, if you haven't already, to read the J reading. Okay, let me jump in here for 1 second. What is going on? I am from the future, I am editing these videos, and trust me, they will get better, right? They start really poor. Please read J. This guy could barely say it, right? But please read J right away, or at least after finishing this first video. But again, they will get better. He will get more confident. He will get funnier. He'll get better looking. His hairline will fill in. Okay, whatever. All right, please hang in there. These will get better. First, let's define what a fallacy is. The most basic definition is a fallacy is an attempt to persuade the audience using emotion instead of relevant reasons. Now, the key in that definition is not the use of emotion, because emotion can be relevant. Let's say someone is asking for your help. They might give you a story that's pretty sad. It's an actual story, and this might inspire your pity and make you want to help them. In that case, using pity is not a fallacy. It was actually relevant to the reasons they needed help. So, the key is relevance, not the emotion. One mistake that I see people use when they try to learn fallacies is they think of it as just like a vocabulary lesson or a matching exercise, where you can imagine there's examples on one side of a page, the list of fallacies on the other side of the page, and you just match the example to the fallacy. Let me explain 3 reasons why I think this is a mistake. First, you will often run into examples where there are many overlapping fallacies. If you did a matching game, this would just look like a spider web of matching everything to everything else. And so we can't think of it as simply a one-to-one relationship, because there can be multiple fallacies in even just the most basic sentence. Second, if we think of this as matching, then we will think that all of the problems are simply found by finding the name of the fallacy. In fact, we should think of the terms as just a handy vocabulary for the most common techniques, but just because it doesn't fit one of our fallacy names doesn't mean there might not be a problem. We could still have a problem, and it's not in our list of names. The third reason we don't want to use matching is that we will find examples that are perfectly relevant even though they look like they might be a fallacy. For example, if I tell someone, right, say right now you're watching this video and I say, oh my gosh, get away from your computer, right, the thing's about to explode, or whatever. Now that's silly, but if there was a real reason to be afraid, you wouldn't say, fallacy, you made me afraid. It depends on whether the fear is relevant to my point. Okay, so now let's talk about the approach we will be using to analyzing fallacies. We will analyze fallacies in 2 steps. And we want to kind of clearly separate these 2 steps because I think of them as involving 2 different parts of the brain. One part of the brain is really good at defining, where another part of our brain is a little better at dealing with abstraction or issues that aren't clearly cut and dry. So, in step 1, what we will be doing is the normal sort of thing you could imagine. We will look at examples and we will list all the possible fallacies that seem to be at work in the technique. There will be some examples where it's just clearly one technique, but just as often there will be multiple fallacies working together. Now, let me also say something about how I will look at this when I grade our big quiz. When I'm grading, there will be 1, maybe 2 fallacies that are doing the most work. These are the primary techniques the author is using to try to trick you into accepting their conclusion. And so that, when I'm grading, finding that primary, maybe 2 primary fallacies will get you the bulk of the credit. Then, in some cases, there will be some secondary fallacies that are playing a minor role. To get the full credit, I would need to see the primary technique. That will get you the bulk of the points for that example. And then if there are some clear secondary techniques, I will expect to see the most important ones of those. But please don't just guess everything that might be at play, because if you have a guess of a fallacy and it clearly plays no role, then I will have to take off little deductions of credit. To repeat, I will be looking for the primary technique and the secondary techniques, but the primary technique will give you the bulk of the credit. In part 2, we will then move from listing the possible fallacies to articulating their relevance. The best way to do this is begin by first quantifying how relevant the fallacy is in the example. The best way to think of this is think of what the example is actually trying to support. What is the conclusion or the sub-conclusion that's being supported? And see, is this relevant as support, or is this an irrelevant fallacy? Now, of course, sometimes things will be somewhere in between. They'll be somewhat relevant, but somewhat a fallacy, and so that's the idea. You want to start part 2 of your analysis by telling me how relevant you think the example is. Maybe it's completely relevant, maybe it's mostly relevant, maybe it's somewhat relevant, maybe it has tiny relevance, or maybe it has zero relevance. Then, your real job, and this is where the bulk of the points come from, is justifying that rating you just gave it. So for example, let's say you run into a case where it has a little bit of relevance, but it's mostly a fallacy. Well, in your articulation, you want to say both of those things. Explain what the relevance is, and then also where the relevance is ruined by the fallacy technique.